The day my daughter told her friends I had never worked a day in my life while sitting in the house, whose mortgage I literally approved every month as CEO of Meridian Financial, I knew our relationship had reached a breaking point I never saw coming. What happened next changed everything between us forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Effie Morrison, and at 64, I thought I had finally earned the right to speak openly about my accomplishments. After 38 years climbing the corporate ladder from a filing clerk to chief executive officer of one of the largest mortgage companies in the Pacific Northwest, I had built something that mattered. But somehow, my own daughter Rebecca had completely erased that history from her mind, reducing my entire career to nothing more than invisible labor that didn't count. It started on a rainy Thursday evening in October when I stopped by Rebecca's house in the suburbs of Portland to drop off some family photos I had digitized from my late mother's collection. Rebecca lived in a beautiful colonial-style home with white shutters and a wraparound porch that she and her husband Marcus had purchased 3 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had personally reviewed their loan application, but Rebecca didn't know that detail. She had no idea that Meridian Financial held their mortgage, and she certainly had no clue that her mother sat in the corner office, making decisions that affected thousands of families just like hers. When I knocked on the front door, I could hear laughter spilling out from the living room. Rebecca opened it with a wine glass in her hand, her cheeks flushed from whatever celebration was happening inside. She looked surprised to see me, glancing back over her shoulder before stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary, and I could see her college friends scattered around the kitchen island, faces I recognized from years of holiday gatherings and graduation parties. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she asked, not unkindly, but with that tone that suggested I was interrupting something important. I held up the manila envelope containing the photos and explained that I had been sorting through Grandma's things and thought she might want copies of the pictures from her childhood. Rebecca took the envelope and set it on the hall table without looking inside, then gestured toward the kitchen where her friends were continuing their animated conversation. I should have left them. I should have made an excuse about having dinner plans or an early morning meeting, but something about the warmth of the house and the sound of easy laughter drew me in. I hadn't realized how quiet my own home had become since retiring 6 months early. After decades of back-to-back meetings, conference calls, and constant decision-making, the silence of my empty house felt oppressive some evenings. Rebecca introduced me to the group, most of whom I had met before, and they were polite enough to include me in their conversation. They were discussing career changes, promotions, and the challenges of balancing work with family life. Sarah, who worked in marketing for a tech startup, was complaining about her demanding boss. Jennifer, a nurse, was talking about the emotional toll of her job. Marcus, Rebecca's husband, chimed in about his recent promotion to senior analyst at an investment firm. I listened quietly, sipping the glass of wine Rebecca had reluctantly poured for me, feeling oddly like an outsider in this group of professionals sharing their work experience. When Sarah asked what I did for a living, I opened my mouth to explain about Meridian Financial, about the complexity of mortgage lending, about the responsibility of overseeing a company that employed over 800 people. But before I could speak, Rebecca laughed and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, my mom never really worked," she said, as if she were sharing an amusing family quirk. "She was always just around the house when I was growing up, very traditional, you know. Dad was the breadwinner." The wine glass nearly slipped from my hand. I stared at Rebecca, waiting for her to correct herself or acknowledge that she was joking, but she had already moved on to asking Jennifer about her upcoming vacation plan. The conversation flowed around me while I sat frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Never really worked. The words echoed in my head like a cruel joke. I thought about the early mornings when Rebecca was in elementary school, when I would drop her off at before-school care so I could be in the office by 7:30 for senior management meeting. I remembered the evenings when I would pick her up from after-school programs, still in my business suit, mentally reviewing loan portfolios while helping her with homework at the kitchen table. I had worked part-time when she was very young, then gradually increased my hours as she got older, but I had always been working, always building something. The promotion to regional manager had come when Rebecca was in middle school. The vice presidency happened during her sophomore year of high school. By the time she graduated, I was already being groomed for the executive suite, but somehow she had never absorbed any of this information. In her mind, I was just Mom, the woman who packed her lunches and attended her soccer games, not Effie Morrison, the professional who had spent decades analyzing market trends and making million-dollar decisions. I excused myself from the group and walked to Rebecca's powder room, ostensibly to freshen up, but really to collect myself before I said something I would regret. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman who had always taken pride in her appearance, even in retirement. My silver hair was professionally styled, my makeup understated but polished. I wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings, the same uniform that had served me well in countless boardrooms. But standing in my daughter's bathroom, listening to her friends discuss their careers in the next room, I felt invisible. When I returned to the kitchen, the conversation had shifted to homeownership and the challenges of the current real estate market. Marcus was explaining how difficult it had been to secure their mortgage, how many hoops they had jumped through, how grateful they were to finally find a lender who understood their situation. I nearly choked on my wine. Their situation had been straightforward compared to many applications I reviewed daily: good credit scores, stable employment, reasonable debt-to-income ratio. The approval had been routine. The mortgage industry is so complicated, Sarah was saying. I don't understand how anyone navigates all those regulations and requirements. Thank goodness for people who understand that stuff. Rebecca nodded emphatically. Seriously, I could never do that kind of work. All those numbers and legal documents, it's like a different language. I set down my wine glass with more force than necessary, the clink echoing sharply in the sudden quiet. Everyone looked at me and I realized this was my moment to speak up, to correct the narrative that had somehow formed around my life. I could explain that I not only understood that different language, but had helped write some of the regulations they were discussing. I could mention that mortgage lending had been my specialty for over 3 decades, that I had started in underwriting and worked my way up through every department. Instead, I heard myself making polite excuses about the late hour and thanking them for the wine. Rebecca walked me to the door, chatting casually about weekend plans and reminding me about Marcus's birthday dinner the following month. She hugged me goodbye with genuine affection, completely unaware that she had just erased 38 years of my professional life with a single careless comment. Driving home through the dark streets of Portland, I replayed the evening over and over, trying to understand how this perception had formed. Had I been so focused on being present for Rebecca's childhood that I had failed to communicate the importance of my work? Had I downplayed my achievements to avoid seeming like I was bragging? Or had Rebecca simply chosen to see only the parts of me that fit her preferred narrative? My house felt even quieter when I walked in, the silence amplified by the contrast with the lively gathering I had just left. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat in my home office, surrounded by the awards and recognition plaques that documented my career progression. Regional Manager of the Year 2008, Outstanding Leadership in Community Development 2000. Each piece of hardware represented years of 60-hour workweeks, difficult decisions, and personal sacrifices that had allowed me to provide Rebecca with opportunities I had never had. I pulled out my laptop and scrolled through my LinkedIn profile, reading the endorsements from colleagues and industry leaders. Phrases like visionary leadership and transformative impact and unparalleled expertise filled the screen. I had connections with executives from major banks, regulatory officials, and community leaders across 3 states. My professional network was vast and respected, built through decades of competence and integrity, yet my own daughter thought I had never worked a day in my life. The next morning, I woke up with a headache that had nothing to do with the wine and everything to do with the conversation that kept replaying in my mind. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the garden I had been neglecting since retirement. The roses needed pruning, the lawn needed mowing, and the flower beds were choked with weeds. For 38 years, I had paid a landscaping service to maintain this yard, because I was too busy building my career to spend weekends on gardening. Now I had all the time in the world, but no motivation to fill it. My phone rang just after 9, and I saw Rebecca's name on the screen. For a moment, I hoped she was calling to apologize, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. To acknowledge that she had misspoken the night before. Instead, she launched into a cheerful recap of the rest of the evening and thanked me for stopping by. She mentioned that Sarah had asked for my recipe for the cookies I had brought to Rebecca's house warming party, the ones I had actually purchased from an expensive bakery, because I had been working late on a complex commercial loan restructuring. "You're so domestic, Mom," Rebecca said with obvious affection. "I wish I had inherited your homemaking skills instead of being such a disaster in the kitchen." Domestic, the word hit me like a physical blow. I had spent my career analyzing risk, managing teams, and making decisions that affected millions of dollars in lending, but in Rebecca's mind, I was defined by cookies and homemaking. I managed to make appropriate responses to her chatter, but when she hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since my first week of retirement. I drove to the Meridian Financial building downtown, parked in the visitor lot, and walked into the lobby I had entered thousands of times over the years. The security guard recognized me immediately and waved me through with a warm greeting. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt familiar and strange at the same time, like returning to a house you used to live in. My former assistant, Patricia, squealed when she saw me approaching the corner office that had once been mine. She had worked with me for 15 years, and had become something like a daughter to me, someone who understood both my professional capabilities and personal dedication to excellence. She updated me on recent developments in the company, the new policies being implemented, and the challenges facing the mortgage industry in the current economic climate. "How's retirement treating you?" she asked, and I found myself struggling to answer. How could I explain that retirement felt like erasure, like all the work I had done for nearly 4 decades had simply vanished the moment I cleaned out my desk? How could I admit that my own daughter had no awareness of what I had accomplished, or why it mattered? Instead, I mentioned that I was still adjusting to the slower pace, and asked about some of the loan officers I had mentored over the year. Patricia filled me in on promotions, transfers and new hires, painting a picture of an organization that continued to thrive based on the foundation I had helped build. The conversation was professionally satisfying but personally hollow. I was already becoming a memory in this place that had defined me for so long. Walking back to my car, I passed the coffee shop where I used to grab my morning latte before important board meetings. The barista who had served me for years was behind the counter, and she recognized me immediately. We chatted briefly about how strange it must be to have free time after so many years of structured days. She mentioned that she had always admired how poised and professional I looked, even during obviously stressful periods. "You were like this powerful presence," she said, smiling. "We always knew when something big was happening because you would order an extra shot of espresso." Powerful presence. The phrase stayed with me as I drove home, contrasting sharply with Rebecca's dismissive comments from the night before. How was it possible that a barista who saw me for 5 minutes each morning understood my professional identity better than my own daughter? That evening, I called my sister Margaret in San Francisco, needing to talk to someone who had witnessed my career journey from the beginning. Margaret was 4 years older and had followed a more traditional path, marrying young and focusing on raising her 3 children while her husband built his medical practice. She had always been supportive of my choices, even when other family members questioned whether I was prioritizing work over motherhood. I told her about the conversation at Rebecca's house, trying to keep my voice level as I repeated Rebecca's casual dismissal of my career. Margaret was quiet for a long moment before responding with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" she said. Rebecca said, "You never worked." Did she forget about all those times you missed family gatherings because of board meetings? Did she forget about the business trips, the late nights, the weekends you spent reviewing loan files? Did she forget that you paid for her college education with your salary? Margaret's indignation was validating but also painful because it highlighted how much Rebecca had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. I had made sacrifices for my career, missed school plays and soccer games, hired babysitters for evening events. I had tried to balance everything, but there had been costs. Perhaps Rebecca's dismissive attitude was her way of coping with feeling like my work had sometimes taken precedence over family time. Maybe she needs to see what you actually did, Margaret suggested. Maybe she's so used to thinking of you as just mom that she can't imagine you in any other role. You should show her your old office, introduce her to your colleagues, help her understand what you built. The idea appealed to me, but it also felt risky. What if Rebecca wasn't interested? What if she dismissed my professional achievements as irrelevant to her current life? What if she saw my need for recognition as petty or attention-seeking? I had spent my career projecting confidence and competence, but this felt vulnerable in a way that professional challenges never had. Over the weekend, I found myself sorting through boxes of career memorabilia that I had brought home when I retired. Performance reviews that documented my steady progression through the company ranks, photos from industry conferences where I had been a keynote speaker, articles from the Business Journal that featured my insights on mortgage lending trends, a framed copy of the press release announcing my appointment as CEO, describing me as a visionary leader with an unparalleled understanding of the residential lending market. Looking at these artifacts of my professional life, I felt a strange disconnection, as if I were reviewing someone else's career. Had I really given speeches to audiences of hundreds of industry professionals? Had I really testified before state regulatory committees about fair lending practice? Had I really built a department from 12 employees to over 200? The evidence was overwhelming, but Rebecca's casual dismissal had made me question the significance of everything I had accomplished. Monday morning brought a call from my former colleague David Chen, who had taken over as CEO when I retired. We had worked together for over 20 years, and he had been instrumental in convincing the board to promote me to the top position when my predecessor retired. David was calling to invite me to a reception honoring women executives in the financial services industry, an event where I would be recognized for my contributions to the field. "You have to come, Effie," he said. "They're specifically highlighting your work on expanding access to homeownership for first-time buyers. The programs you developed have helped thousands of families achieve their dreams of owning a home." The recognition was gratifying, but it also emphasized the disconnect between how I was perceived in professional circles versus how my own daughter saw me. Industry leaders wanted to honor my achievements, but Rebecca didn't even know what those achievements were. I accepted the invitation, partly because I genuinely wanted to support other women in the industry, but also because I was beginning to formulate a plan. That evening I called Rebecca and mentioned the upcoming reception, describing it as a professional event where I would be honored for my work in mortgage lending. She seemed genuinely surprised that I was involved in anything professional, asking questions that revealed how little she understood about my career. "I didn't know you knew about mortgages," she said, and I had to grip the phone tighter to keep from saying something sharp in response. "I've worked in mortgage lending for most of my adult life," I said carefully. "It's been my career since before you were born." There was a pause, and I could hear her processing this information as if it were completely new. "I guess I never really thought about what you did during the day when I was at school," she admitted. "I just knew you were always home when I got there." Always home when she got there. The comment revealed how much effort I had put into maintaining that illusion of availability. I had rearranged meeting schedules, conducted conference calls from my car, and brought work home every night to ensure that Rebecca never felt like my career was more important than her needs. I had been so successful at hiding the demands of my job that she had concluded I didn't have one. "Would you like to come to the reception with me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "It might be interesting for you to see what I do." What I did, Rebecca agreed, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. We made plans for her to meet me at the hotel where the event was being held, and I spent the rest of the week carefully planning what I would wear and what I would say. This felt like an opportunity to bridge the gap between who Rebecca thought I was and who I actually was, but I was nervous about her reaction. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the Heathman Hotel, the same venue where Meridian Financial had held its annual shareholder meetings during my tenure as CEO. I arrived early, partly out of habit, and partly because I wanted to compose myself before Rebecca got there. The room filled quickly with familiar faces from across the industry, colleagues and competitors who greeted me with genuine warmth and respect. "Effie Morrison," called out Janet Walsh, the president of a rival mortgage company. "How's retirement treating you?" "We miss having you to keep us all honest," Similar greetings came from every corner of the room as I made my way through the crowd: regional bank presidents, regulatory officials, real estate industry leaders, and fellow executives who had worked with me on various initiatives over the year. The conversation was effortless, filled with industry terminology and shared experiences that reminded me how deeply embedded I had been in this professional community. Rebecca arrived just as the formal program was beginning, looking slightly overwhelmed by the size and sophistication of the event. She had dressed appropriately in a navy dress and heels, but I could see her scanning the room with obvious uncertainty. I introduced her to several colleagues, watching her face as they shared stories about working with me on complex deals or seeking my advice on challenging situations. "Your mother is a legend in this industry," said Tom Rodriguez, a longtime loan officer who had worked under my supervision for over a decade. "She taught me everything I know about risk assessment. When I was starting out, she would spend hours explaining the nuances of different loan products and how to match them with borrower needs." Rebecca nodded politely, but I could see she was struggling to reconcile this image of me with the person she thought she knew. When the formal presentations began, I was introduced as a pioneer in the field of responsible lending and invited to the stage to accept a recognition award for my contributions to housing accessibility. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of industry professionals who understood and respected my work, I felt more like myself than I had in months. I spoke about the evolution of mortgage lending over my career, the importance of balancing profitability with social responsibility, and the satisfaction of helping families achieve homeownership. The audience was engaged and appreciative, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated their familiarity with my work. After the formal program ended, Rebecca and I found a quiet corner of the lobby to talk. She seemed subdued, processing everything she had witnessed during the evening. I waited for her to speak first, curious about her reaction to seeing me in this context. "I had no idea," she said finally. "I mean, I knew you had a job, but I didn't realize you were so important. All those people knew you. They talked about you like you were famous or something." Important. Famous. The words felt both validating and sad because they highlighted how completely Rebecca had misunderstood my professional life. I tried to explain how I had gotten started in the industry, how I had worked my way up through different positions, how I had balanced career demands with motherhood, but I could see that she was still struggling to integrate this new information with her existing perception of me. "Why didn't you ever tell me about all this?" she asked. "Why didn't I know that you were a CEO?" The question hung between us like an accusation, and I realized that part of the blame belonged to me. I had been so focused on being present for her childhood that I had failed to share the parts of myself that existed outside our mother-daughter relationship. I had wanted her to see me as available and nurturing, not as someone whose time and attention were constantly demanded by professional obligations. "I guess I wanted you to feel like you were my priority. I didn't want you to worry about my work or feel like it was competing with you for my attention." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "But it was competing, wasn't it?" she said. "And I never even knew what I was competing against." The drive home was somber, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I had achieved my goal of showing Rebecca my professional identity, but the revelation had created as many questions as answers. How many other assumptions about our relationship were based on incomplete information? How much of our family dynamic had been shaped by my decision to compartmentalize my life so completely? Over the next few days, Rebecca called several times with follow-up questions about my career, my work, and my experiences in corporate leadership. She seemed genuinely curious, but also somewhat hurt that she had been excluded from such a significant part of my life. I tried to answer her questions honestly while also helping her understand the context of the choices I had made. But even as we began to have more open conversations about my professional life, I could sense that something fundamental had shifted between us. Rebecca was seeing me differently now, but I wasn't sure if that was entirely positive. The mother she had always known was being replaced by someone more complex and perhaps less accessible. I had gained her respect, but possibly at the cost of the easy intimacy we had always shared. Then, 2 weeks after the reception, something happened that changed everything between us in a way I never could have anticipated. Rebecca called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tight with stress and barely controlled panic. "Mom," she said, "we might lose the house." Marcus had been laid off 3 weeks earlier, Rebecca explained through tears that came in waves over the phone. His investment firm had eliminated his entire division in what they called a restructuring initiative. But what everyone knew was a cost-cutting measure disguised in corporate speak. They had savings but not enough to cover the mortgage payments for more than 2 months, and Marcus was discovering that senior analyst positions in his field were scarce in the current market. I listened to Rebecca's panicked explanation while standing in my kitchen, gripping the granite countertop so hard my knuckles went white. The irony of the situation was so profound it felt like the universe playing a cruel joke. My daughter was terrified of losing her home, not knowing that her mother had the power to ensure that would never happen. Not knowing that the mortgage she was so worried about paying was held by the company I had run for over 5 years. The company where my word still carried significant weight despite my retirement. "We've been trying to figure out our options," Rebecca continued, her voice breaking. "Marcus has been applying for jobs every day, but everything either pays too little or requires us to relocate. And with the baby coming," she trailed off, and I realized she had buried the most important news in the middle of her crisis. "Baby?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant," she said, and I could hear her crying harder now. "We found out last week, and we were so excited, but now with Marcus being unemployed and the mortgage payment, I understood the impossible position they were in, trying to start a family while facing potential financial ruin." My mind immediately went into problem-solving mode, the same analytical approach that had served me well throughout my career. I knew exactly what options were available to homeowners in their situation. I knew about forbearance programs, loan modification procedures, and hardship provisions that could provide temporary relief. I also knew that Meridian Financial had some of the most flexible policies in the industry when it came to working with borrowers facing unexpected financial difficulty. But I couldn't share any of that knowledge without revealing what I had never told Rebecca about her mortgage, about my company, about my ability to help them in ways she couldn't imagine. The conversation I had been avoiding for 3 years was suddenly unavoidable, but the timing felt terrible. How could I tell her the truth now when she was vulnerable and scared, without it seeming like I had been manipulating the situation from the beginning? "Have you talked to your mortgage company about your options?" I asked carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Marcus called them yesterday," Rebecca said, "but they just gave him some generic information about hardship programs and told him to fill out paperwork. It all sounds so complicated, and we don't even know if we qualify for any." I closed my eyes, knowing exactly which customer service representative Marcus had probably spoken with, knowing exactly what forms he had been told to complete, knowing that the hardship review process would ultimately land on the desk of someone who reported to my successor. The bureaucracy that seemed so intimidating to Rebecca was a system I had helped design and refine over years of balancing corporate interests with genuine customer service. "Maybe I could help you understand the paperwork," I offered. "I might know more about these programs than you think." Rebecca accepted my offer with obvious relief, and we arranged for me to come over the following evening to review their financial documents and help them navigate the mortgage company's requirements. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at my phone and trying to decide whether to call David Chen immediately or wait until I had more information about Rebecca's specific situation. The ethical implications of my position were complex and troubling. As the former CEO of Meridian Financial, I had access to information and influence that could help my daughter in ways that weren't available to other borrowers. But using that access felt like a violation of the professional standards I had maintained throughout my career. I had always prided myself on treating all customers fairly, without favoritism or special considerations based on personal relationships. On the other hand, Rebecca was facing a crisis that could have been easily resolved if she had simply known to ask the right questions or speak to the right people. The gap between what was possible and what seemed possible to her was largely a matter of knowledge and connections, advantages that I could provide without technically violating any company policy. I spent most of the night researching current mortgage industry practices, reading through recent changes in federal regulations, and reviewing Meridian Financial's updated hardship policy. My laptop screen glowed in the darkness of my home office as I compiled information that could help Rebecca and Marcus present their case in the strongest possible terms. I drafted sample letters, gathered documentation requirements, and prepared explanations of various relief programs that might apply to their situation. By morning, I had created a comprehensive strategy for navigating their mortgage company's bureaucracy, but I still hadn't decided how much to reveal about my own connections to the process. The thought of Rebecca learning the truth in the middle of her crisis felt manipulative, but the thought of watching her struggle with problems I could easily solve felt equally wrong. Marcus answered the door when I arrived at their house the next evening, and I was shocked by how much he had aged in the 3 weeks since his layoff. His face was drawn and pale, his usually confident demeanor replaced by an anxious energy that reminded me of loan applicants who were afraid their dreams of homeownership were about to be crushed. He led me into their dining room, where stacks of financial documents were spread across the table like evidence of a crime they couldn't solve. Rebecca emerged from the kitchen carrying a pot of tea, moving more slowly than usual in a way that suggested morning sickness was complicating her already stressful situation. She had been crying recently, her eyes red and puffy, and when she tried to smile at me, the expression looked forced and fragile. "Thank you for coming, Mom," she said, settling into the chair beside me. "We've been staring at all this paperwork for hours, and none of it makes sense. It's like they designed it to be confusing on purpose." I almost laughed at the accuracy of her observation. Mortgage paperwork was notoriously complex, partly due to regulatory requirements, but also partly due to institutional habits that prioritized legal protection over customer clarity. I had spent years trying to simplify Meridian Financial's communication style, but progress had been slow against decades of industry tradition. "Let's start with the basics," I said, pulling their mortgage statement toward me. "What exactly did the customer service representative tell Marcus when he called?" Marcus pulled out a notebook where he had recorded the details of his conversation with Meridian Financial's customer service department. As he read through his notes, I recognized the standard script that representatives used for initial hardship inquiry. He had been told about forbearance options, loan modification possibilities, and refinancing programs, but without the context needed to understand which options might actually be useful for their specific situation. "Did they mention anything about executive review procedure?" I asked, knowing that most customers were never informed about escalation processes that could bypass standard bureaucratic delays. Marcus looked puzzled. "Executive review? No, they didn't mention anything like that. Is that something we should ask about?" I nodded, making notes on a legal pad about strategies they could pursue. Large mortgage companies often have special review processes for borrowers who meet certain criteria. The key is knowing how to request that level of attention. For the next 2 hours, I walked them through their financial documents, helping them organize information in ways that would strengthen their case for mortgage relief. I explained how to calculate debt-to-income ratios, how to document temporary versus permanent income changes, and how to present their situation in terms that would resonate with underwriters and review committees. Rebecca watched me work with obvious amazement, asking questions that revealed how little she had understood about my level of financial sophistication. When I explained the difference between loan modification and refinancing, or when I described how mortgage companies evaluated hardship applications, she stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language she hadn't known I could understand. "Mom, how do you know all this stuff?" she asked finally. "You're talking like you work in this industry or something." The moment I had been dreading had arrived with such casual innocence that I almost missed. Rebecca was giving me the perfect opening to explain my connection to Meridian Financial, to reveal that I not only worked in the industry but had helped shape many of the policies we were discussing. But looking at her exhausted face and hearing the vulnerability in her voice, I couldn't bring myself to add that complication to her already overwhelming situation. "I've learned a lot about mortgages over the years," I said, which was technically true but woefully incomplete. "When you're considering a major purchase like a house, you tend to research these things pretty thoroughly." The explanation seemed to satisfy Rebecca, who was too stressed to probe deeper into my apparent expertise. Marcus was more curious about the practical applications of my knowledge, asking detailed questions about timeline expectations and approval processes that I answered based on my insider understanding of how Meridian Financial actually operated. By the end of the evening, we had prepared a comprehensive hardship package that addressed every requirement I knew the company would have. I had helped them craft letters that used the precise language most likely to trigger positive responses from review committees. I had organized their financial documentation in exactly the format that would make the strongest impression on underwriters. I had given them phone numbers for departments that most customers never knew existed, and names of supervisors who had the authority to make exceptions to standard policy. "This is incredible, Mom," Rebecca said, gathering the papers we had prepared. "I feel like we actually have a chance now. I don't know how you knew to do all this, but you've given us hope when we didn't have it." Driving home that night, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and guilt that left me emotionally exhausted. I had genuinely helped Rebecca and Marcus present their case in the strongest possible terms, but I had done so while withholding information that could have made their situation much simpler. A single phone call from me to David Chen could have resolved their mortgage issues within days, but making that call would have required explanations I wasn't ready to provide. I also realized that helping them navigate the system had reminded me how much I missed the intellectual challenges of my career, analyzing their financial situation, developing strategic approaches to their problems, and applying my knowledge of industry practices, had engaged parts of my mind that had been dormant since retirement. For the first time in months, I felt useful in ways that extended beyond domestic activities or social pleasantries. The next morning, I called Patricia at Meridian Financial and asked if she could provide me with general information about current processing times for hardship applications. I was careful not to mention Rebecca's case specifically, but I wanted to understand what kind of timeline they might be facing. Patricia was happy to chat about industry trends and company updates, and our conversation gave me additional insights that I could share with Rebecca without revealing my sources. "Hardship reviews are taking about 6 to 8 weeks right now," Patricia told me, "but applications that are well prepared and include all required documentation can sometimes move faster through the system." 6 to 8 weeks felt like an eternity when I knew that Rebecca and Marcus were already struggling to cover their monthly payment. I found myself mentally reviewing the staff assignments in the hardship review department, trying to remember which managers were most efficient and which ones had reputations for expediting urgent cases. That afternoon, Rebecca called to update me on their progress. Marcus had submitted their hardship application using the strategy we had developed, and he had requested the executive review process I had recommended. The customer service representative had seemed surprised by his knowledge of the company's internal procedures, but she had confirmed that their case would be flagged for priority attention. The woman Marcus talked to said she had never had anyone request executive review before, Rebecca told me. "She seemed impressed that we knew about it." "How did you know about that option, Mom?" I deflected the question by focusing on the positive aspects of their situation, but I could hear the curiosity in Rebecca's voice growing stronger. She was beginning to notice patterns in my knowledge that didn't fit with her understanding of my background. Each time I provided information that seemed too specific or too insider-focused, she filed it away as another piece of evidence that I wasn't quite who she thought I was. A week later, Rebecca called with news that their application had been approved for a temporary forbearance program that would reduce their payments by 60% for 6 months, with an option to extend for an additional 6 months if Marcus remained unemployed. The approval had come much faster than the standard timeline, and the terms were more generous than what most borrowers received in similar situations. "They called it an exceptional circumstances approval," Rebecca said, her voice bright with relief for the first time in weeks. The manager who called Marcus said, "Our application was one of the most well-prepared packages they had ever received. She actually asked if we had professional help putting it together." I smiled, knowing exactly which manager had reviewed their case and recognizing her communication style in the feedback Rebecca was sharing. Jennifer Martinez had worked under my supervision for 3 years before I promoted her to department head, and she had always been generous with positive reinforcement when borrowers exceeded her expectations. "I'm so glad it worked out," I said, meaning every word. "You and Marcus did a great job presenting your situation clearly. We never could have done it without your help," Rebecca insisted. Seriously, Mom, you saved our house. I don't know where you learned all that stuff about mortgages, but you knew exactly what to do. The gratitude in her voice was deeply satisfying, but it was also tinged with something that might have been suspicion. Rebecca was clearly puzzled by the extent of my knowledge, and I could sense that she was beginning to form questions that would be harder to deflect with vague explanations about research and general financial literacy. That weekend, Marcus found a new position with a smaller investment firm at a salary that was about 15% lower than his previous job, but still sufficient to cover their mortgage payments once the forbearance period ended. The timing felt providential, and Rebecca was euphoric about their sudden reversal of fortune. She called to share the news and to invite me to a celebration dinner where she wanted to thank me properly for my help during their crisis. The dinner was held at their favorite restaurant, a small Italian place with excellent food and intimate lighting that made conversation feel natural and unguarded. Rebecca and Marcus were both more relaxed than I had seen them in weeks, and their relief was infectious. They ordered wine to celebrate, though Rebecca only had a few sips due to her pregnancy, and the mood was festive in a way that reminded me of happier family gatherings. "I want to make a toast," Rebecca said, raising her water glass toward me. "To my mom, who somehow knew exactly how to save our house when we didn't even know where to start. I still don't understand how you became such an expert on mortgage lending, but I'm grateful beyond words." Marcus joined the toast with obvious sincerity, and I found myself moved by their appreciation, even as I felt guilty about the deception that had made my help possible. They had no idea that their mortgage was held by a company where I could have resolved their problems with a single conversation, and they certainly had no idea that the efficient processing of their application had probably been influenced by my reputation within the organization. As we ate dinner, the conversation naturally turned to their future plans and their excitement about the coming baby. Rebecca was about 8 weeks pregnant, and they had already started discussing names and nursery themes, with the enthusiasm of first-time parents who finally felt secure enough to embrace their expectations. Watching their happiness, I felt a deep satisfaction that extended beyond my role in resolving their mortgage crisis. "Have you thought about what kind of education fund you want to set up?" I asked, knowing that college costs were a concern for most new parents. Marcus looked surprised by the question. "We've talked about it, but we figured we had 18 years to figure that out. Do you think we should start planning already?" I spent the next 20 minutes explaining different approaches to educational savings, tax advantage investment options, and strategies for balancing long-term planning with immediate financial needs. Rebecca and Marcus listened with obvious interest, taking notes, and asking questions that showed they were genuinely engaged with the topic. "Mom, you really should consider becoming a financial advisor," Rebecca said with a laugh. "You know more about this stuff than our accountant does." "Where did you learn all this?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that my cover story about general financial literacy was becoming increasingly inadequate. Rebecca was smart enough to recognize that my knowledge went well beyond what a typical homeowner would acquire through casual research. She was beginning to suspect that there were significant aspects of my background that she didn't understand. "I've always been interested in financial planning," I said, which was true but incomplete, "and I've had good advisors over the years who taught me a lot about different investment strategies." The explanation satisfied Marcus, but I could see Rebecca filing away another piece of evidence that didn't quite fit her understanding of my background. She was beginning to look at me with the same analytical expression I had often seen when she was solving complex problems at work, as if I were a puzzle she was determined to figure out. After dinner, we walked through the downtown area where their restaurant was located, enjoying the mild evening air and the energy of other people celebrating their own Friday night milestones. Rebecca linked her arm through mine as we strolled, a gesture of affection and connection that reminded me of how much our relationship meant to me, despite its complications. "I've been thinking about something," she said as we paused to look at a storefront display. "When I was telling my friends about how you helped us with the mortgage stuff, they were all amazed. Sarah said her parents wouldn't have had any idea how to handle something like that. It made me realize that maybe I don't know as much about you as I thought I did." I felt my chest tighten with anticipation and anxiety. This was the moment I had been both hoping for and dreading, the point where Rebecca was ready to ask direct questions about my background and experience. But I still wasn't sure how much truth I was prepared to share, or how she would react to learning about the extent of my professional accomplishments. "What would you like to know?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the significance of the moment. Rebecca was quiet for a few steps, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "I guess I'm wondering about your work history. I know you had jobs when I was growing up, but I never really understood what you did or how important it was. At that reception you took me to, everyone seemed to know you and respect you in ways that surprised me." I took a deep breath, recognizing that this conversation could change our relationship in fundamental ways. "My career was in mortgage lending," I said carefully. "I started as a clerk and worked my way up through different positions over the years." "What kind of positions?" Rebecca asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity rather than casual interest in her voice. "I was a loan officer for several years, then a manager, then a regional director. Eventually I became an executive at one of the larger mortgage companies in the area." Rebecca stopped walking and turned to face me directly. "An executive? Mom, what does that mean exactly?" The directness of her question made further evasion impossible. I looked into her eyes, seeing the daughter who had always been smart and perceptive, and realized that she deserved the truth even if it complicated everything between us. "I was the chief executive officer of Meridian Financial," I said quietly. "I ran the company for over 5 years before I retired." Rebecca stared at me for a long moment, and I watched as the implications of this revelation processed across her face. She was connecting dots between my knowledge of mortgage procedures, my familiarity with industry practices, and the respect I had received at the professional reception. But I could also see her struggling with the fact that I had hidden such a significant aspect of my identity from her. "Meridian Financial," she repeated slowly. "Mom, that's who holds our mortgage." I nodded, feeling the weight of the secret I had been carrying for 3 years. "Yes, so when we were going through all that paperwork, when you were helping us figure out what to say and how to present our case," she trailed off, but I could see understanding dawning in her expression. "I knew exactly what the company would be looking for, because I helped design many of those policies," I admitted. Rebecca sank onto a nearby bench, and Marcus sat beside her with a confused expression as he tried to follow a conversation that had suddenly taken a dramatic turn. I remained standing, feeling exposed and vulnerable, in a way that reminded me of my most challenging board meetings, when directors had questioned my decisions and demanded explanations for strategies they didn't understand. "I can't believe this," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother was the CEO of a major corporation, and I told people she never worked. I dismissed your entire career like it was nothing, and you never corrected me." The pain in her voice was worse than any anger would have been. I could see that she was hurt not just by my deception, but by her own ignorance of something so fundamental about my identity. She was also probably embarrassed about the casual way she had dismissed my professional life in front of her friends, now knowing that her dismissive comments had been completely wrong. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, looking up at me with tears in her eyes. "Why did you let me think you were just a housewife when you were running a company?" I sat down on the bench beside her, trying to find words that could explain decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now felt misguided and hurtful. "I wanted you to see me as your mother first," I said. "I was afraid that if you knew about the demands of my job, you would feel like work was more important to me than you were." "But it was important to you," Rebecca said, "and that should have been okay." I should have known that my mother was accomplished and successful, and making a difference in the world. Marcus had been listening to our conversation with growing amazement, and he finally spoke up with a question that had obviously been bothering him. "Miss Morrison, when you helped us with our mortgage application, did you influence the approval process?" It was a fair question, and one I had been dreading. "I didn't contact anyone at the company about your specific case," I said truthfully, "but I did help you present your application in ways that I knew would get positive attention from the review committee." "That's still," Marcus started, then stopped, apparently unsure how to finish his thought. "I know it's complicated. I had access to knowledge and understanding that other borrowers don't have, and I used that to help you. I've been struggling with the ethics of that decision since it happened." Rebecca was quiet for a long time, processing everything I had told. When she finally spoke, her voice was calmer but still tinged with hurt. "I feel like I need to rethink everything I thought I knew about you," she said, "and I feel stupid for not knowing something so basic about my own mother." "You're not stupid," I said firmly. "I made deliberate choices to keep my work life separate from our family time. Maybe those choices were wrong, but they came from wanting to protect our relationship, not from wanting to deceive you." We sat on the bench for another 20 minutes, talking through the implications of my revelation and trying to understand how our relationship would change going forward. Rebecca asked questions about my career progression, my responsibilities as CEO, and my reasons for retiring when I did. Marcus wanted to understand more about the mortgage industry and how companies like Meridian Financial made decisions about loan application. By the time we walked back to our cars, the immediate shock of my disclosure had faded into something more manageable, but I could sense that Rebecca was still processing the fundamental shift in how she understood my identity. She hugged me goodbye with obvious affection, but there was also a thoughtfulness in her expression that suggested she would be reviewing our entire relationship through this new lens. Driving home that night, I felt simultaneously relieved and anxious about having finally shared the truth about my career. The secret I had been carrying for months was finally out in the open, but I wasn't sure whether the revelation had brought Rebecca and me closer together or created new distance between us. Only time would tell whether my decision to help her through her mortgage crisis, while hiding my connection to the process, had been an act of love or a form of manipulation. What I didn't know was that Rebecca was already beginning to ask questions that would lead to discoveries I had never intended her to make. Rebecca didn't call for 3 days after our conversation outside the restaurant, and the silence felt heavier than any argument we had ever. I found myself checking my phone constantly, drafting text messages that I never sent, and replaying every word of our exchange to analyze whether I had handled the revelation properly. The relief I had initially felt about finally sharing the truth was quickly overshadowed by anxiety about how fundamentally it might change our relationship. When she finally did call, her voice carried a strange formality that I had never heard before, as if she were speaking to a business associate rather than her mother. She thanked me again for helping with their mortgage situation, but the gratitude felt distant and carefully measured. She asked polite questions about my health and my activities, but avoided any mention of my career or the implications of what she had learned about my professional identity. "I've been doing some research," she said near the end of our conversation, and something in her tone made me grip the phone tighter. "I looked up Meridian Financial online, and I found some articles about the company's growth over the past few years. Your name was mentioned in several of." I waited for her to continue, sensing that this was leading somewhere I might not want to follow. Rebecca had always been thorough when she set her mind to investigating something, a trait that had served her well in her marketing career but was now making me uncomfortable. "There was a profile piece in the Business Journal from 2 years ago," she continued. "It talked about your leadership style and your impact on the mortgage industry. The article made it sound like you were pretty well known in financial circles." "I suppose I was," I said carefully, unsure how much detail she wanted me to provide. "The article mentioned that you testified before Congress about fair lending practices." "Mom, you testified before Congress? That's not something small business executives do. That's something people do when they're considered experts in their field." I could hear the hurt beneath her words, the realization that my professional accomplishments had been far more significant than I had ever indicated. The congressional testimony had been one of the highlights of my career, an opportunity to advocate for policies that would make homeownership more accessible to working families. I had prepared for weeks, consulted with policy experts, and delivered remarks that were later cited in the final legislation. "It was an honor to be asked," I said, which felt inadequate but true. "There were photos from the hearing," Rebecca said quietly. "You were sitting at a table with other industry leaders, speaking into microphones in front of all those senators. You looked so confident and professional." I kept staring at the pictures because I couldn't reconcile them with the person I thought you. The conversation continued for another few minutes, but the undercurrent of bewilderment and hurt never dissipated. Rebecca was discovering that her mother had lived an entire professional life that she had known nothing about, and each new piece of information seemed to widen the gap between her perceptions and reality. After we hung up, I walked to my home office and pulled out the folder containing press clippings and professional recognition from my career. I spread the articles across my desk, seeing them through Rebecca's eyes for the first time. Headlines like Morrison leads industry innovation in community development, and Meridian Financial CEO recognized for ethical leadership, painted a picture of someone whose work had genuine impact and widespread recognition. Looking at the congressional testimony photos that Rebecca had found online, I remembered the mixture of nervousness and excitement I had felt that day. The hearing room had been packed with industry representatives, consumer advocates, and journalists, covering the proposed legislation. My testimony had focused on the importance of maintaining rigorous underwriting standards while expanding access to credit for underserved communities, a balance that required both financial expertise and social consciousness. I had been proud of my performance that day, proud of representing my company and my industry in a forum that could influence national policy. But I had never shared that pride with Rebecca, never explained why the work mattered, or how it felt to be recognized as someone whose opinion could shape important decisions. I had treated my professional accomplishments as private victories rather than family celebration. The next morning brought an unexpected call from Jennifer Martinez, the manager at Meridian Financial, who had handled Rebecca's mortgage modification. Jennifer had worked closely with me for several years, and we had maintained a friendly relationship even after my retirement. She was calling to ask if I knew anything about a loan file that had caught her attention. "I had an interesting case last week," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the mix of curiosity and professionalism that I remembered from our working relationship. A young couple applied for hardship relief, and their application was so well prepared that it looked like it had been put together by someone with inside knowledge of our procedures. My stomach dropped as I realized where this conversation was heading. Jennifer was too experienced and too smart not to notice when an application demonstrated unusual sophistication in its approach to the company's internal processes. "Their documentation was perfect," she continued. "They used exactly the right terminology, provided precisely the information we need, and even requested executive review using language that suggested familiarity with our internal hierarchy. It was the kind of application that usually comes from borrowers who are working with attorneys or former industry professionals." I remained silent, hoping Jennifer would move on to other topics, but she pressed forward with the persistence that had made her an excellent manager. "The interesting thing is that when I called to approve their modification, the husband mentioned that his mother-in-law had helped them prepare their application. He was very grateful and kept talking about how knowledgeable she was about mortgage procedures. He said her name was Effie Morris." The silence that followed felt endless. Jennifer was waiting for me to respond, and I could hear the wheels turning in her mind as she connected the dots between my name, my expertise, and the unusually sophisticated application she had reviewed. "Effie," she said finally, "please tell me you didn't help your daughter navigate our hardship process without disclosing your connection to the company." "It's complicated," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate as an explanation. "No, it's not complicated," Jennifer replied, her voice taking on the authoritative tone I remembered from her most serious conversations. "It's a conflict of interest. You used inside knowledge to help your family members receive preferential treatment from a company where you used to be the CEO. That's exactly the kind of situation that our ethics policies are designed to prevent." I knew she was right, but I also knew that my motivations had been more complex than a simple abuse of power. "I didn't contact anyone at the company about their case," I said. "I just helped them present their information more effectively, using knowledge that other borrowers don't have access to," Jennifer pointed out, "knowledge that you gained through years of working inside the system. That's still an unfair advantage, even if you didn't make any direct call." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Jennifer explaining the potential implications of my actions and expressing concern about how the situation might be perceived if it became more widely known within the company. She wasn't threatening me, but she was making it clear that my decision to help Rebecca while concealing my identity had created ethical problems that could reflect poorly on both of us. "I need to think about how to handle this," Jennifer said before we hung up. "I may need to report the situation to my supervisors, depending on how much attention the case has attracted internally." After ending the call, I sat in my office feeling the full weight of the mistakes I had made. In my desire to help Rebecca while preserving the secret of my professional identity, I had created a situation that could damage my reputation and potentially cause problems for people like Jennifer who had trusted me throughout my career. The ethical standards I had always prided myself on maintaining had been compromised by my personal relationships in ways that felt both inevitable and completely avoidable. That afternoon, I received a text message from Rebecca asking if we could meet for coffee later in the week. Her tone was polite but distant, suggesting that she had more questions about my career and wanted to have a conversation in a neutral setting. I agreed to meet her at a small cafe near her office, but I spent the intervening days dreading what she might have discovered through her continued research. When I arrived at the cafe on Thursday morning, Rebecca was already seated at a corner table with her laptop open and several printed articles spread in front of her. She looked up when I approached, and I could see immediately that her investigation into my professional background had deepened significantly since our last conversation. "Hi, Mom," she said, standing to hug me with the same careful politeness that had characterized our recent interaction. "Thanks for meeting me. I know this is probably awkward, but I have some questions that I need to ask you directly." I ordered coffee and settled into the chair across from her, noticing that the articles she had printed included several that I recognized from major business publications. One was the congressional testimony piece she had mentioned on the phone, but others covered my appointment as CEO, my initiatives in community development lending, and my recognition by various industry organizations. "I've been reading about your career," Rebecca began, gesturing toward the papers on the table, "and I'm starting to understand that you weren't just successful in mortgage lending, you were apparently one of the most influential executives in the entire industry." I nodded, unsure how to respond to a statement that was both accurate and somehow felt like an accusation. "This article from Forbes," she continued, picking up one of the printouts, "calls you a pioneer in socially responsible lending. It says you developed programs that help thousands of families qualify for mortgages who wouldn't have been able to get them otherwise. Is that true?" "Yes," I said simply. "One of my priorities as CEO was expanding homeownership opportunities for working families who had been underserved by traditional lending practices." Rebecca stared at me for a moment, and I could see her struggling to reconcile this information with her long-held perception of my priorities and values. "Mom, you were fighting for social justice through your work. You were using your position to help people who needed advocacy and support. That's incredible, and I had no idea." The admiration in her voice was gratifying, but it was also tinged with sadness that felt more painful than any criticism would have been. Rebecca was discovering that her mother had been engaged in meaningful work that aligned with her own values, but she was learning about it through newspaper articles rather than family conversations. "Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" she asked, echoing the question that had been hanging between us since my initial revelation. "Why didn't you share something that was obviously so important to you?" I took a sip of my coffee, buying time to formulate an answer that could capture the complexity of decisions that had seemed reasonable when I made them, but now felt short-sighted and selfish. "I was afraid that if you knew how demanding my work was, you would feel neglected or unimportant," I said. "I wanted you to feel like you were my top priority, but I was your priority," Rebecca said with obvious frustration. "You came to my school events, you helped with my homework, you were there when I needed you. You could have done all of that and still been proud of your professional accomplishments. You could have been both a good mother and a successful executive." She was right, and her clarity about something I had made unnecessarily complicated felt like a rebuke to years of unnecessary compartmentalization. I had created false choices between professional success and maternal devotion, when in reality the two aspects of my identity could have coexisted and even reinforced each other. "I think I was afraid that you would see my work as competition for my attention," I admit. "I didn't want you to feel like boardrooms and business trips were more important to me than your childhood." "But they weren't more important," Rebecca said. "You proved that by the choices you made about how to spend your time. You could have trusted me to understand that adults have complex lives with multiple responsibilities. We talked for another hour, with Rebecca asking questions about specific aspects of my career, and me providing details that I should have shared years earlier. She wanted to know about the challenges I had faced as a woman in executive leadership, the satisfaction I had derived from mentoring other professionals, and the impact I thought my work had made on the industry as a whole. Each question revealed how much she had missed by not understanding this fundamental aspect of my identity, and each answer seemed to deepen her sense of loss about the conversations we had never had. By the time we finished our coffee, Rebecca seemed emotionally exhausted from the effort of rewriting her understanding of who her mother was and what had motivated her choices throughout my career. "I need some time to process all of this," she said as we prepared to leave. "It's not that I'm angry with you, exactly, but I feel like I'm mourning the relationship we could have had if you had trusted me with the truth about your life." The drive home from our coffee meeting was one of the longest 30 minutes I had ever experienced. Rebecca's phrase about mourning the relationship we could have had echoed in my mind, forcing me to confront the possibility that my efforts to protect our bond had actually damaged it in ways that might not be repairable. That evening, I called my sister Margaret to discuss the situation and seek advice about how to move forward with Rebecca. Margaret listened patiently as I described the revelations of the past week and the growing tension between my desire to be honest and my fear of further damaging our relationship. "You created this problem by trying to control how Rebecca saw you," Margaret said with the directness that had always characterized our conversations. "Now you have to let her decide how she wants to respond to learning the truth. You can't manage her reaction the same way you tried to manage her perception." Margaret's observation was harsh but accurate. I had spent years curating Rebecca's understanding of my priorities and identity, and now I was facing the consequences of that manipulation. Rebecca needed space to recalibrate her relationship with me based on complete information, and my attempts to guide that process were likely making things worse. "What if she decides that our relationship was built on too many lies?" I asked. "What if she can't trust me anymore?" "Then you'll have to live with that consequence," Margaret replied. "But Rebecca is smart and fair-minded. If you give her time and space to work through this, she'll probably find a way to forgive you. The question is whether you can forgive yourself for making it necessary." Over the next 2 weeks, Rebecca and I exchanged polite text messages about practical matters, but avoided any substantive conversations about my career or the implications of my earlier deception. She sent photos from her doctor's appointments and updates about Marcus's new job, but the easy intimacy that had always characterized our communication felt strained and artificial. I threw myself into volunteer activities and social commitments, trying to distract myself from the anxiety of waiting for Rebecca to decide how she wanted our relationship to proceed. I joined the board of a nonprofit housing organization, started attending book club meetings with neighbors I barely knew, and signed up for art classes that I had been postponing since retirement. But none of these activities provided the satisfaction or sense of purpose that I had hoped they would. I found myself missing not just my career but also the easy relationship I had enjoyed with Rebecca before she learned about my professional accomplishment. The irony was bitter. I had hidden my success to preserve our bond, but the revelation of that success was now threatening the very relationship I had tried to protect. 3 weeks after our coffee meeting, Rebecca called with news that initially seemed unrelated to our ongoing tension. She had been contacted by a journalist who was writing an article about women executives in the financial services industry, and my name had come up during the research process. She wanted to interview me about what it was like growing up as the daughter of a prominent CEO, Rebecca said, her voice carefully neutral. "She seemed surprised when I told her I didn't know you were a CEO until recently." The journalist had apparently been planning to include me in a feature about how successful women balanced career demands with family responsibilities, using interviews with executives and their adult children to explore different approaches to work-life integration. Rebecca's admission that she had been unaware of my professional identity had shifted the focus of the article in directions that made both of us uncomfortable. "What did you tell her?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I told her the truth," Rebecca said, that you had kept your career separate from our family life, and that I was still learning about your professional accomplishments. She seemed very interested in that angle. I could imagine exactly how a journalist would frame that story, turning my attempts to protect Rebecca's childhood into evidence of the impossible choices that working mothers faced in corporate environments. The narrative would probably focus on the costs of success for women who felt pressured to hide their ambitions from their own families. She wants to interview both of us, Rebecca continued. She thinks our story illustrates something important about how successful women navigate the expectations placed on them by society and by their family. The prospect of discussing our relationship in a public forum felt invasive and potentially damaging, but I also recognized that Rebecca's willingness to participate in the article represented a significant shift in how she was thinking about my career and its impact on our family dynamic. How do you feel about doing an interview like that? I asked. Rebecca was quiet for a moment before responding. I think it might help me understand some things that I'm still confused about, she said, and I think it might help other mothers and daughters who are dealing with similar issues. We scheduled the interview for the following week, and I spent the intervening days trying to prepare for questions that would inevitably focus on the most complicated aspects of my relationship with Rebecca. The journal, a woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in writing about women in leadership, had sent a list of potential topics that included my motivations for compartmentalizing my professional and personal lives, Rebecca's reaction to learning about my career, and our current efforts to rebuild trust and understanding. The interview took place at my house, with Sarah Chen asking thoughtful questions that revealed she had done extensive research about both my career and the broader challenges facing women in executive positions. Rebecca and I sat in my living room, surrounded by the awards and recognition that I had never explained to her, discussing our relationship with a candor that felt both therapeutic and exposing. Effie, when you decided not to discuss your work with Rebecca, what did you hope to accomplish? Sarah asked, and I found myself articulating motivations that I had never fully examined even in my own mind. I wanted Rebecca to feel secure in her importance to me. I was afraid that if she understood how much time and energy my career required, she would feel like she was competing with my professional obligations for my attention and affection. Rebecca, how do you feel about that explanation now? Sarah continued. Rebecca looked at me before answering, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. I understand why my mother made those choices, but I wish she had trusted me to handle more complexity in our relationship. I think I could have been proud of her accomplishments while still feeling loved and prioritized. The interview continued for over 2 hours, covering topics that Rebecca and I had never discussed openly and forcing us to articulate feelings that had remained unspoken even during our recent difficult conversation. Sarah Chen's questions were skillfully designed to elicit insights about the broader implications of our experience, but they also created opportunities for Rebecca and me to communicate more directly than we had been able to manage in private. What do you think you've learned from this experience? Sarah asked, near the end of our conversation. I've learned that trying to control how other people perceive you usually backfires. I thought I was protecting our relationship by keeping my professional life private, but I was actually creating distance between us. Rebecca nodded in agreement. And I've learned that I made assumptions about my mother's life that were completely wrong. I'm realizing that I never asked her about her work because I assumed it wasn't important or interesting. That says something about my own biases that I need to examine. When the interview concluded, Sarah Chen thanked us for our honesty and explained that the article would be published in about 6 weeks, pending fact-checking and editorial review. She mentioned that our story had given her insights into issues that many working mothers and their adult children might recognize in their own relationship. After Sarah left, Rebecca and I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of my professional achievements that had prompted so many questions during the interview. For the first time in weeks, the silence between us felt comfortable rather than strained. I've been thinking about something, Rebecca said eventually. When I was growing up, I knew you were smart and capable, but I thought those qualities were directed entirely toward taking care of me and Dad. It never occurred to me that you might be using those same skills to build something significant in the world outside our family. I wanted you to feel like you and your father were my whole world, I said. I thought that was what good mothers were supposed to do. Rebecca shook her head with a sad smile. Good mothers show their children that women can be complex, accomplished people who have multiple sources of meaning and satisfaction in their lives. You could have been a role model for professional success while still being a devoted mother. The conversation that followed was the most honest and productive we had shared since learning about my career. Rebecca asked questions about specific challenges I had faced as a woman in corporate leadership, and I shared stories about mentoring other women, advocating for policy changes, and finding satisfaction in work that aligned with my values. By the time Rebecca left that evening, something fundamental had shifted between us. We hadn't resolved all the trust issues that my years of compartmentalization had created, but we had established a foundation for building a more authentic relationship going forward. What neither of us knew was that the article Sarah Chen was writing would attract attention that would force us to confront the most complicated consequences of my decision to help Rebecca with her mortgage, while concealing my connection to Meridian Financial. The call came on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks before Sarah Chen's article was scheduled to be published. David Chen's voice carried a tension I had rarely heard during our years of working together, and I knew immediately that Jennifer Martinez had followed through on her threat to report my involvement in Rebecca's mortgage modification to senior manager. "Effie, we need to talk," David said without any of the usual pleasantries that typically opened our conversations. "Can you come in this afternoon? There's a situation that requires immediate attention." I agreed to meet him at 3 o'clock, spending the intervening hours trying to prepare mentally for a conversation that could permanently damage my professional reputation. The irony was devastating. After decades of maintaining impeccable ethical standards, I was facing potential disgrace because I had tried to help my daughter navigate a crisis while concealing my identity from her. The drive to Meridian Financial felt surreal, like returning to a place that had once been home but now felt foreign and unwelcoming. I parked in the visitor lot rather than using the executive spaces where I had parked for 5 years, a small but symbolic acknowledgement that my status at the company had fundamentally changed. Patricia greeted me with obvious discomfort when I arrived at the executive floor, her usual warmth replaced by professional distance that suggested she had been briefed about the purpose of my visit. She escorted me directly to David's office, bypassing the casual conversation that had characterized our previous interactions. David stood when I entered, but he didn't offer his usual handshake or invitation to sit in the comfortable chairs where we had conducted countless strategic discussions. Instead, he gestured toward the formal conference table where disciplinary meetings were typically held, a choice that immediately signaled the seriousness of the situation. "Jennifer Martinez brought a concerning matter to my attention yesterday," David began without preamble. "She believes that you may have used inside knowledge of our procedures to help your daughter obtain preferential treatment during a recent hardship review." I had rehearsed various responses to this accusation, but sitting across from David in the formal setting of a potential ethics investigation, my prepared explanations felt inadequate and defensive. "I helped Rebecca prepare her application using knowledge I gained through my career experience," I said carefully, "but I didn't contact anyone at the company or attempt to influence the review process directly." David opened a file folder and extracted several documents that I recognized as copies of Rebecca's mortgage application and supporting material. "Jennifer has reviewed your daughter's submission in detail," he said, "and she's identified multiple instances where the language and approach demonstrate sophisticated understanding of our internal policies and procedures." He spread the papers across the table, pointing to specific phrases and organizational strategies that I had suggested to Rebecca and Marcus. Seeing my advice translated into official documentation made the extent of my involvement more obvious than I had realized when I was providing guidance in their dining room. "The application requests executive review using terminology that's not available to the general public," David continued. "It references specific regulatory guidelines that most borrowers wouldn't know about. It includes documentation presented in exactly the format that our underwriters prefer, down to the order of supporting material. Each observation was accurate and damaging, building a case that I had provided Rebecca with advantages that were unavailable to other borrowers in similar situations. The fact that I hadn't made direct contact with company personnel was becoming increasingly irrelevant in the face of evidence that I had essentially coached her through the process using insider knowledge. Jennifer also discovered that you attended the hardship department's training sessions on new federal guidelines just 2 months before your daughter's application was submitted, David said, producing another document from the file. The application incorporates several provisions from those updated guidelines that haven't been widely publicized yet. I remembered those training sessions clearly, having attended them as part of my preparation for retirement to ensure that my successor would have access to the most current information about regulatory change. The irony was that I had been trying to be responsible about the transition of my duties, but that same diligence had given me knowledge that I later used to help Rebecca. David, my motivations were purely personal, I said, trying to shift the focus from the technical violations to the emotional context that had driven my decisions. Rebecca was facing a crisis that threatened her home and her growing family. I used my knowledge to help her present her case effectively, but I didn't seek any special treatment that wouldn't have been available to other borrowers with similar circumstances. That's not the point, David replied with obvious frustration. The point is that you had access to information and understanding that other borrowers don't have, and you used that access to benefit your family. It doesn't matter that your intentions were good. What matters is that you created an unfair advantage through your former position at this company. The conversation continued for another 45 minutes, with David methodically reviewing the evidence that Jennifer had compiled and explaining the potential consequences of my action. The company's ethics policies were clear about conflicts of interest involving former executives, and my situation fell squarely within the prohibited categories of behavior. I'm required to report this matter to the board of directors, David said. Fine. There will need to be a formal investigation, and depending on the findings, there could be consequences that affect your pension and benefits. There's also the possibility that the story could become public, which would reflect poorly on both you and the company. The mention of potential publicity made my stomach drop as I realized that Sarah Chen's article about my relationship with Rebecca was scheduled to be published in less than 2 weeks. If the ethics investigation became public knowledge around the same time, the combination of stories could create a media firestorm that would overshadow any positive messages about women in leadership. Is there anything I can do to minimize the impact of this situation? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be disappointing. David considered the question for a moment before responding. You could request that your daughter refinance her mortgage with a different company, he said. That would eliminate the ongoing conflict of interest and demonstrate that you're taking the situation seriously. You could also consider making a public statement, acknowledging your mistake and explaining the steps you're taking to address it. Neither option was appealing, but I could see the logic in David's suggestions. Asking Rebecca to refinance would be complicated and expensive, but it would remove the appearance of ongoing impropriety. A public statement would be humiliating but might help control the narrative if the story attracted media attention. I'll need to discuss this with Rebecca, I said. She doesn't know about the ethics investigation yet, and she's going to be upset about the potential consequences of my decision to help her. David nodded with obvious sympathy, and for the first time during our meeting, his expression softened slightly. I know this is difficult. Your career at this company was exemplary, and everyone who worked with you respected your integrity. This situation doesn't erase those decades of ethical leadership, but it does create problems that need to be addressed. Walking to my car after the meeting, I felt the weight of professional disgrace in ways that I had never experienced during my career. I had always prided myself on maintaining clear boundaries between personal relationships and business decisions, but my desire to help Rebecca had compromised those standards in ways that felt both inevitable and completely avoidable. The drive home gave me time to consider how to explain the situation to Rebecca, who was still processing the revelations about my career and trying to rebuild trust in our relationship. Adding the news that my decision to help her had created an ethics scandal would complicate everything we had been working to repair. I called Rebecca that evening and asked if I could come over to discuss something important. Her voice immediately took on the worried tone that had become familiar during Marcus's unemployment crisis, and she agreed to see me right away despite the late hour. When I arrived at their house, Rebecca and Marcus were waiting in the living room with expressions that suggested they were prepared for bad news. I had been dreading this conversation all day, but seeing their anxious faces made the task even more difficult than I had anticipated. The mortgage help I gave you has created some complications. I began, trying to find a way to explain the situation without making them feel responsible for problems they hadn't known they were creating. My former colleagues at Meridian Financial have raised concerns about potential conflicts of interest. Rebecca's face went pale as she processed the implications of what I was saying. Conflicts of interest. Mom, what does that mean exactly? I explained the ethics investigation as gently as possible, emphasizing that David Chen and Jennifer Martinez were following standard procedures rather than targeting me personally. But I could see Rebecca absorbing the information with growing horror as she realized that her mortgage crisis had inadvertently damaged my professional reputation. "This is my fault," she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "If I hadn't asked for your help, none of this would have happened. You could get in serious trouble because you tried to save our house." Marcus was asking practical questions about the investigation timeline and potential consequences, but Rebecca seemed focused entirely on the guilt she felt about creating problems for me. The irony was painful. She was now experiencing exactly the kind of responsibility for my professional challenges that I had tried to shield her from throughout her childhood. "It's not your fault," I said firmly. "You didn't know about my connection to Meridian Financial when you asked for help. I made the decision to provide guidance without disclosing that connection, and I'm responsible for the ethical implications of that choice." We talked until nearly midnight, exploring various approaches to the situation and discussing the potential need for Rebecca and Marcus to refinance their mortgage with a different company. The process would be expensive and time-consuming, but it seemed like the most straightforward way to eliminate the ongoing conflict of interest. "We'll do whatever we need to do," Marcus said with obvious determination. "If refinancing helps resolve this situation for you, then that's what we'll do. We can't let you suffer consequences because you helped us when we were desperate." Rebecca nodded in agreement, though I could see that she was still struggling with feelings of guilt and responsibility. "I keep thinking about all the assumptions I made about your life," she said. "I dismissed your career like it was nothing, and now I'm learning that helping me could destroy your professional reputation. How did I get everything so wrong?" The next morning brought a call from Sarah Chen, who had apparently heard rumors about the ethics investigation through her industry contact. As a journalist specializing in business coverage, she was connected to networks that included current and former Meridian Financial employees, and news of my situation was beginning to circulate within those circles. "I'm calling to give you an opportunity to comment on some information that's come to my attention," Sarah said with the professional courtesy that journalists typically extended when seeking responses to potentially damaging stories. "I understand that there may be questions about your involvement in your daughter's mortgage application. I had been expecting this call since leaving David Chen's office, but I was still unprepared for the reality of discussing my personal crisis with a reporter." Sarah's article about my relationship with Rebecca was supposed to focus on work-life balance challenges faced by successful women, but the ethics investigation was transforming it into a scandal story with much broader implications. "I can confirm that there's an ongoing review of my actions," I said carefully. "I'm cooperating fully with that process, and I'm not able to provide detailed comments while the investigation is pending." Sarah pressed for more specific information about the timeline of events and the nature of the assistance I had provided to Rebecca, but I declined to elaborate beyond acknowledging that I had helped my daughter navigate the mortgage modification process. The conversation was brief but professionally cordial, and Sarah indicated that she would be reaching out to other sources for additional perspectives on the story. After we hung up, I realized that the situation was moving beyond my ability to control the narrative or minimize the damage to my reputation. The combination of the ethics investigation and the journalistic interest was creating a public relations crisis that could overshadow my entire career legacy. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my former mentor, Robert Harrison, who had retired as CEO of a major regional bank several years earlier. Robert had heard about my situation through industry connections,
and he was calling to offer support and advice based on his own experience navigating corporate controversy. "These things have a way of becoming much bigger than they need to be," Robert said with the calm voice of someone who had survived multiple professional crises. "The key is to get ahead of the story and take control of the narrative before other people define it for you." Robert suggested that I consider hiring a public relations consultant who specialized in crisis management for corporate executives. He also recommended that I prepare a comprehensive statement explaining my actions and demonstrating accountability for any mistakes I had made. "The worst thing you can do is let this situation fester while other people speculate about your motivations," he said. "If you're proactive about addressing the issues and showing that you take the ethical concerns seriously, you can minimize the long-term damage to your reputation." Following Robert's advice, I contacted a crisis management firm that had experience helping executives navigate ethics scandals and public relations challenges. The consultant I spoke with, a woman named Lisa Patel, explained that my situation was actually less damaging than many cases she had handled, but it required immediate action to prevent the story from spiraling out of control. "The narrative right now is that a successful female executive used her influence to help her family," Lisa said during our initial phone consultation.
That's not inherently scandalous, but it becomes problematic if people start questioning whether you received your position through favoritism or whether you routinely bent rules for personal benefit. Lisa recommended a three-part strategy that included accepting responsibility for my mistakes, demonstrating concrete steps to address the ethical concerns, and providing context that would help people understand my motivations without excusing my actions. She also suggested that Rebecca and I consider doing a joint interview that would allow us to control how our story was presented to the public. The prospect of additional media attention was daunting, but I could see the logic in Lisa's approach. Rather than allowing other people to speculate about my relationship with Rebecca and my motivations for helping her, we could provide our own account of the events and their significance. That evening, I called Rebecca to discuss the public relations strategy and gauge her willingness to participate in media interviews about our situation. She was initially reluctant to attract more attention to the crisis, but she eventually agreed that taking control of the narrative was preferable to letting other people define our story. "I don't want anyone to think that you're a corrupt executive who abused her power," Rebecca said. "You made a mistake, but you made it because you were trying to help your daughter. People should understand the context even if they don't agree with your decision." Over the next week, Lisa Patel worked with both of us to prepare for media interviews and develop messaging that would acknowledge my ethical lapses while emphasizing the family dynamics that had influenced my choices. The strategy was designed to humanize the story and help people understand that my actions had been motivated by love rather than greed or corruption. The board meeting where my case would be formally reviewed was scheduled for the following Thursday, and David Chen had indicated that the directors would be making decisions about potential disciplinary actions based on the investigation finding. The possible consequences ranged from a formal reprimand to the suspension of my pension benefits, depending on how seriously the board viewed my violations of company ethics policy. 2 days before the board meeting, Sarah Chen's original article about my relationship with Rebecca was published in a prominent business magazine. The piece was thoughtful and nuanced, focusing on the challenges that successful women faced in balancing professional achievement with family relationships. But the article also included references to the ongoing ethics investigation, transforming what could have been a positive story about work-life balance into a cautionary tale about the perils of mixing personal and professional responsibility. Reading the article online, I was struck by how different my relationship with Rebecca looked when described by an outside observer. Sarah Chen had captured the genuine love and mutual respect that existed between us, but she had also highlighted the communication failures and trust issues that had created unnecessary complications in our lives. The article quoted Rebecca extensively, and her comments revealed how much she had grown and changed through the process of learning about my career. "I spent my whole life thinking my mother was just a traditional housewife," Rebecca was quoted as saying. "Learning that she was actually a powerful executive who chose to hide her accomplishments to protect our relationship has forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about women, work and family priority. The piece concluded with observations about the broader implications of our story for other families dealing with similar dynamics. Sarah Chen suggested that my experience illustrated the costs of compartmentalization and the importance of authentic communication between parents and adult children about the complexities of professional life. Within hours of the article's publication, I received calls from colleagues, friends, and industry contacts who had read the piece and wanted to express support or ask questions about the situation. Most of the responses were sympathetic, with people acknowledging that my actions had been motivated by understandable concerns even if they had created ethical problems. But there were also critics who viewed my behavior as evidence of entitled thinking among corporate executives, who believed that rules didn't apply to their personal relationship. Online comments on the article were particularly harsh, with some readers suggesting that I represented everything wrong with executive privilege and corporate culture. The day before the board meeting, I received an unexpected call from Jennifer Martinez, who wanted to discuss the situation one more time before the directors made their final decision. Her tone was more conciliatory than it had been during our previous conversations, suggesting that she was uncomfortable with the broader implications of the investigation she had initiated. "I want you to know that I didn't intend for this to become such a public spectacle," Jennifer said. "When I reported your involvement in your daughter's case, I was following company policy, but I didn't anticipate that it would attract media attention or create such serious consequences for your reputation." I appreciated Jennifer's call, but I also understood that she had been caught in an impossible position between her loyalty to me personally and her responsibilities as a manager. The ethics policies that required her to report potential conflicts of interest were designed to protect both employees and the company from exactly the kind of situation we were now facing. "You did what you had to do," I told her. "I put you in an unfair position by helping Rebecca without considering how that would affect other people at the company." Jennifer mentioned that several board members had expressed concerns about the precedent that would be set by their decision in my case. If they imposed severe penalties, it could discourage other former executives from maintaining relationships with the company. But if they were too lenient, it might suggest that ethical rules applied differently to people with senior positions or personal connections. The morning of the board meeting arrived with gray skies and steady rain that seemed appropriate for the somber occasion. I dressed carefully in the same navy suit I had worn for important presentations during my tenure as CEO, trying to project confidence and professionalism despite the circumstance. Rebecca had offered to attend the meeting with me for moral support, but I had declined her offer because I didn't want her to feel more responsible for the situation than she already did. This was my professional crisis to navigate, and I needed to face the consequences of my decisions without involving her further in the process. The boardroom at Meridian Financial looked exactly as I remembered it from countless strategic planning sessions and quarterly reviews. The long mahogany table, the formal portraits of previous CEOs, and the view of downtown Portland through floor-to-ceiling windows created an atmosphere of corporate gravitas that emphasized the seriousness of the proceeding. David Chen opened the meeting by reviewing the investigation findings and explaining the ethical concerns that had been raised about my action. He presented the evidence methodically and objectively, but I could hear disappointment in his voice as he described how my behavior had violated the standards that we had worked together to establish and maintain. The board members asked pointed questions about my motivations, the timeline of events, and the steps I had taken to address the situation once it came to light. Their inquiries were professional but searching, designed to understand not just what I had done but why I had made choices that seemed inconsistent with my previous ethical standard. When given the opportunity to make a statement, I acknowledged my mistakes without making excuses or shifting blame to other people. I explained that my desire to help Rebecca had clouded my judgment about the ethical implications of using inside knowledge to assist her with her mortgage application. I also outlined the steps I had taken to address the situation, including my willingness to encourage Rebecca to refinance with a different company. The board deliberated for nearly 2 hours while I waited in David's office, trying to read or review emails, but finding it impossible to concentrate on anything other than the conversations taking place down the hall. The weight of my entire professional legacy seemed to hang in the balance, dependent on how a group of directors interpreted the ethical significance of decisions I had made out of love for my daughter. When David finally called me back into the boardroom, his expression was serious but not hostile. The board chairman, a veteran banker named Thomas Wright, who had worked with me on numerous industry initiatives, delivered the verdict with obvious reluctance. The board has determined that your actions constituted a conflict of interest that violated company ethics policies, he said formally. However, we also recognize that your motivations were personal rather than financial, and that you have cooperated fully with the investigation process. The penalty they imposed was significant but not devastating, a formal censure that would become part of my permanent record, along with the requirement that I reimburse the company for the administrative costs of the investigation. My pension benefits would remain intact, but I would be prohibited from serving in any advisory or consulting capacity with Meridian Financial for a period of 2 years. We want to be clear that this action reflects our commitment to maintaining ethical standards rather than any broader judgment about your character or your contributions to this company. Thomas continued, "Your career here was exemplary, and this incident doesn't erase the positive impact you made during your tenure as CEO." Leaving the boardroom after the meeting, I felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. The consequences were serious enough to acknowledge the gravity of my ethical violations, but they weren't severe enough to destroy my professional reputation or financial security. The formal censure would be a permanent reminder of my mistake, but it wouldn't prevent me from rebuilding my standing in the industry or finding new ways to contribute to causes I cared about. The drive home from Meridian Financial felt like the end of one chapter in my life and the uncertain beginning of another. I had survived the professional crisis that resulted from my decision to help Rebecca, but I was still grappling with the personal and emotional consequences of years of compartmentalization and deception. What I didn't know was that the resolution of the ethics investigation would create new opportunities for honest communication with Rebecca, leading to discoveries about our relationship that neither of us had anticipated. 3 months after the board meeting, Rebecca called with news that would change everything between us in ways I never could have imagined. She had been researching refinancing options as we had discussed, working with a mortgage broker to find better terms with a different lender. During that process, she had discovered something that made all our previous conversations about my career seem insignificant by comparison. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," she said, her voice carrying a tone I had never heard before, something between amazement and disbelief. "When you were CEO of Meridian Financial, did you personally approve our original mortgage application 3 years ago?" The question hit me like a physical blow, even though I had been dreading it since the day Rebecca and Marcus first bought their house. Of all the secrets I had kept about my professional life, this was the one that felt most invasive and manipulative. Not only had I hidden my career from Rebecca, but I had been directly involved in one of the most important financial decisions of her adult life without her knowledge. "Yes," I said simply, knowing that any attempt to explain or justify would only make the situation worse. "Your application came across my desk for final approval because of the loan amount and your first-time buyer status. I signed off on it personally." The silence that followed was longer and more profound than any we had shared during months of difficult conversations about my career. I could hear Rebecca breathing on the other end of the line, and I imagined her processing the implications of what I had just confirmed. "You approved our mortgage," she repeated slowly, as if saying the words might help her understand their meaning. "You made the decision that allowed us to buy our house, and you never told us. We had no idea that we owed the most important thing in our lives to our own mother." I tried to explain that their application had been straightforward and would have been approved by any competent underwriter, but Rebecca wasn't interested in hearing about their creditworthiness or the strength of their financial profile. She was focused on the fundamental deception that had characterized our relationship for 3 years. Every time we talked about our mortgage payments, every time we worried about interest rates or discussed refinancing options, "You knew things about our loan that we didn't know ourselves," she said, her voice rising with each word. "You had access to our financial information, our payment history, everything about our most private financial business." The accusation was accurate and devastating. As CEO, I had indeed had access to detailed information about every aspect of their mortgage, from their initial application through their recent hardship modification. I had known about their payment patterns, their escrow balances, and their credit report updates throughout the entire 3-year period. "I never looked at your account information after approving the initial loan," I said, which was technically true but felt inadequate as a response to her broader concerns about privacy and manipulation. "But you could have," Rebecca said. "At any time you could have pulled up our file and seen exactly how we were managing our biggest financial obligation. You had that power over us, and we never knew it existed." That evening Rebecca came to my house for what felt like the most important conversation we had ever had. She arrived alone, having told Marcus that she needed to work through this latest revelation with me privately before involving him in discussions about what it meant for their marriage and their relationship with me. We sat in my living room, surrounded by the awards and recognition that had prompted so many questions about my professional identity over the past few months. But this conversation felt different from our previous discussions, because Rebecca was no longer discovering my accomplishments as much as she was uncovering the depth of my involvement in her personal life. "I keep thinking about the house hunting process," she said, staring at her hands rather than looking at me directly. "We spent months looking at properties, comparing neighborhoods, trying to figure out what we could afford. You came with us to open houses, gave us advice about different areas, helped us think through the pros and cons of various options." I remembered those weekends clearly, the excitement of helping Rebecca and Marcus find their first home, the satisfaction of sharing their dreams, while knowing I would be in a position to help make those dreams possible. At the time, I had seen my involvement as a gift I could give them without their knowledge, a way of ensuring their happiness while maintaining the boundaries I thought were necessary to protect our relationship. "The whole time you knew that their mortgage application would end up on your desk," Rebecca continued. "You knew that you would be making the final decision about whether they could buy the house they fell in love with. How could you not tell us something that important?" I tried to explain the reasoning that had seemed sound at the time, that disclosure would have created pressure and awkwardness, that their application was strong enough to merit approval regardless of our relationship, that I wanted them to succeed, based on their own merits, rather than familial connections. "But it wasn't based on our own merits," Rebecca said with obvious frustration. "Even if our application was technically qualified, the fact that the CEO was my mother must have influenced how carefully it was reviewed, how quickly it was processed, how generous the terms were. We got advantages that other borrowers didn't have, and we never even knew we were receiving them." The conversation continued for hours, with Rebecca working through the implications of my involvement in their mortgage, while I tried to help her understand the constraints and motivations that had shaped my decision. But I could see that each explanation felt like another revelation of deception, another example of how I had controlled aspects of her life without her knowledge or consent. "I feel like our entire adult relationship has been built on lies," she said finally, tears streaming down her face. "Not intentional lies maybe, but omissions and secrets that changed everything about how our interactions really worked." The pain in her voice was worse than any professional consequence I had faced during the ethics investigation. Rebecca wasn't just angry about my deceptions, she was grieving the loss of a relationship that she was beginning to realize had never been as authentic as she had believed. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca and I maintained polite but distant contact while she worked through her feelings about my involvement in her mortgage and the broader pattern of secrecy that had characterized my approach to our relationship. She kept me updated about her pregnancy and Marcus's adjustment to his new job, but the easy intimacy that had always existed between us felt strained and artificial. I threw myself into volunteer work and community activities, trying to find purpose and satisfaction in pursuits that didn't carry the ethical complications that had tainted my attempts to help Rebecca. I joined the board of a literacy nonprofit, started tutoring adult learners at the community college, and volunteered with a program that helped low-income families navigate the home buying process. The irony of working with first-time homebuyers was not lost on me, given the mortgage crisis that had damaged my relationship with Rebecca, but I found genuine satisfaction in using my industry knowledge to help people who lacked the resources and connections that my daughter had unknowingly benefited from throughout her life. One evening in late November, I received a call from Marcus asking if he could come over to talk privately. Rebecca was at a doctor's appointment, and he wanted to discuss the situation without her immediate involvement. I agreed, curious about his perspective on the ongoing tension between Rebecca and me. When Marcus arrived, he seemed more serious and thoughtful than I had ever seen him. He accepted my offer of coffee and settled into the living room chair where Rebecca usually sat during our difficult conversations. "I wanted to talk to you about something that Rebecca doesn't know yet," he began, and I felt my stomach tighten with anticipation of another revelation or complication. "I've been thinking a lot about your involvement in our mortgage and what it means for our relationship going forward," he continued, "and I've come to some conclusions that I think you need to hear." Marcus explained that he had spent considerable time researching the mortgage industry and talking to colleagues who had gone through similar home buying processes. His investigation had convinced him that Rebecca and I were both overreacting to my role in their loan approval. "Every mortgage application gets reviewed by senior executives at some level," he said. "The fact that you happen to be Rebecca's mother doesn't change the fundamental reality that we qualified for the loan based on our income, credit, and down payment. If anything, your position probably made you more careful about ensuring that our application met all the standard criteria." I was surprised by Marcus's perspective, but I could see that he had thought through the situation more analytically than emotionally. As someone who worked in financial services himself, he understood the institutional processes that governed lending decisions and the professional obligations that constrained executive behavior. "Rebecca is hurt because she feels like you controlled something important without her knowledge," Marcus continued, "but I think she's missing the bigger picture about what your career actually meant and why you made the choices you did." Marcus went on to explain his theory that my compartmentalization of professional and personal life had been a reasonable response to the challenges facing women in executive positions during the earlier stages of my career. He suggested that Rebecca's reaction was influenced by generational differences in expectations about work-life integration and transparency. She grew up in an era when successful women were expected to be open about their achievements, he said. "But you built your career when women executives had to make much more difficult choices about how to balance professional success with family relationships." The conversation with Marcus gave me a different perspective on the conflicts that Rebecca and I had been struggling to resolve. I began to see that some of our disagreements reflected broader cultural shifts in how professional women were expected to navigate competing demands and expectations. A few days later, Rebecca called to apologize for her distance and to ask if we could meet for lunch to discuss our relationship more constructively. She had been talking with friends and colleagues about the challenges facing women in leadership positions, and she had gained new insights into the pressures that had shaped my choices throughout my career. "I've been thinking about mom guilt," she said when we met at a restaurant near her office. "The constant worry that working mothers have about whether they're damaging their children by pursuing professional success. I'm already feeling it, and I'm only 4 months pregnant." Rebecca explained that her pregnancy was giving her first-hand experience with the impossible expectations placed on working women, particularly those in demanding careers. She was beginning to understand why I might have felt pressure to compartmentalize my professional life to protect her from feeling neglected or unimportant. "I still think you should have trusted me with more information about your work," she said. "But I'm starting to understand why you made the choices you did. You were trying to protect me from feeling like I was competing with your career for your attention." We talked about the specific challenges that women executives faced in maintaining authentic relationships with their children while managing demanding professional responsibility. Rebecca was particularly interested in learning about the strategies I had developed for being present during important moments in her childhood. "Despite the constant demands of my position at Meridian Financial, I remember you being at all my important events," she said. "School plays, soccer games, graduation ceremonies. I never felt like your work was more important than I was. Maybe that was worth the trade-off of not knowing all the details about your professional life." The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship, shifting from recrimination and hurt feelings toward mutual understanding and appreciation for the complexity of the choices we had both made. Rebecca was beginning to see my career decisions through the lens of her own emerging experience as a working mother, while I was learning to understand her need for transparency and authentic communication. Over the following months, we worked together to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of greater honesty and mutual respect. Rebecca asked detailed questions about my experiences as a woman in corporate leadership, and I shared stories and insights that I had never felt comfortable discussing during her childhood. We also collaborated on practical matters related to her pregnancy and her plans for balancing motherhood with her marketing career.
My experience managing professional responsibilities while raising a child gave me perspectives that Rebecca found valuable, while her fresh approach to work-life integration challenged some of my assumptions about the trade-offs that career success requires. In February, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter whom she and Marcus named Emma Catherine, honoring both my mother and Rebecca's determination to maintain strong intergenerational connection. Holding my granddaughter for the first time, I felt a profound sense of completion and possibility, as if all the struggles and misunderstandings of the previous year had led to this moment of pure joy and connection. "I want Emma to know about your career from the beginning," Rebecca said as I rocked the baby in the hospital room. "I want her to understand that her grandmother was a powerful, accomplished woman who made a difference in the world. I don't want her to discover that accidentally when she's 30 years old." The commitment to transparency that Rebecca was making represented everything we had learned about the importance of authentic communication between generations of women. Emma would grow up knowing that professional success and maternal devotion were not mutually exclusive, that women could pursue ambitious careers while maintaining close family relationships. 6 months after Emma's birth, Rebecca surprised me with a proposal that seemed to emerge from all our conversations about my career and her aspirations for our family's future. She suggested that we collaborate on writing a book about the challenges facing professional women and their adult children, using our own experience as a case study for broader issues affecting working families. "I think our story could help other mothers and daughters avoid some of the misunderstandings we went through," she said. "There are probably lots of families dealing with similar issues about career expectations, family priorities, and intergenerational communication." The book project gave us a shared purpose that channeled our hard-won insights into something that could benefit other people facing similar challenges. Working together on research, interviews, and writing created opportunities for ongoing conversation about topics that had been sources of conflict between us. The book was published 18 months later under the title Hidden in Plain Sight: A Mother and Daughter Navigate Career, Family, and the Cost of Secret. The response from readers was overwhelmingly positive, with many women sharing their own stories about balancing professional achievement with family relationships. Rebecca and I began giving joint presentations at conferences and events focused on women's leadership and work-life integration. Speaking together about our experience created a new dimension to our relationship, one where we functioned as colleagues and collaborators rather than just mother and daughter. Looking back on the crisis that had nearly destroyed our relationship, I realized that my attempts to protect Rebecca from the complexity of my professional life had actually deprived both of us of opportunities for deeper connection and mutual understanding. The revelation of my career and the ethical investigation that followed had been painful, but they had ultimately led to a more authentic and satisfying relationship than we had ever had before. Emma is now 3 years old, and she already knows that her grandmother used to run a big company that helped families buy houses. When she plays with her toy blocks, she sometimes announces that she's building offices where important meetings happen. Rebecca and I smile at each other when we hear these declarations, knowing that Emma is growing up with a more complete understanding of women's possibilities than either of us had at her age. The mortgage that caused so much conflict between Rebecca and me was eventually refinanced with a different company, eliminating the last vestige of professional entanglement between my former career and their financial life. But the lessons we learned about honesty, trust, and the complexity of love continue to shape our relationship in ways that make us both stronger and more authentic than we were before the truth came to light. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Rebecca had never lost her job, if their financial crisis hadn't forced me to reveal my professional expertise, if the ethics investigation hadn't exposed all the secrets I had been keeping. But I've come to believe that the truth has a way of emerging eventually, and that our relationship is better for having survived the difficult process of learning to see each other clearly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.